Hello, and welcome to the final lecture of Trails West for Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. I'm Brad Berzer. This is lecture number 14, 1890 and the conclusion of the American frontier. Now, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, 1890 is only a convenient date for looking at the end of the American frontier. But I want to give three reasons why I think it's a convenient date. Number one, Sitting Bull dies, very importantly, and I'll talk about his significance here in just a moment. Number two, we have to see that the final battle, or at least massacre, of the 19th century occurs in 1890 at the very end of that year with the massacre at Wounded Knee in late December of 1890, right after the death of Sitting Bull. The other thing, the third reason that we can claim that the frontier closes in 1890 is 1890 is the very last year, as Frederick Jackson Turner pointed out, that we can actually see a frontier line that moves from the east to the west, running north to south, but essentially fits that old narrative of the idea of moving from Plymouth Rock all the way to Rodeo Drive and seeing that continuous movement. If we look at a map in 1893, we have to note that there is no, or a map of 1890, in the census of 1890, there is no actual frontier line that can be seen, nothing distinguishable. There are pockets of the frontier, but no frontier left at all. So what I would like to do in this final lecture as we think about what the American frontier means and why it ended, I want to talk about one of the greatest figures. I've already talked a little bit about Crazy Horse and Nez Perce's Chief Joseph in previous lectures, but I want to end here with one of my favorites. Would he be my favorite of the three? I'm not sure, but he's certainly one of the three great men of Indian civilization, of Western civilization, and of North American civilization. And this is Sitting Bull. And I love this picture of him here. We've talked about it in a previous lecture I have. And you can see what a combination you have of all kinds of cultures in this one figure. And of course, that face. That incredibly stoic, amazing face. Seneca in the modern world there. The Sitting Bull looking as ferocious as possible. He is sometimes remembered as a warrior. It's important to note he was not a warrior. He did not have the status of warrior. He was a medicine man. He was a very important leader among his people. Certainly he was regarded as the most virtuous of all the Sioux, among the Sioux in the 19th century. He was seen as the greatest among the Sioux. And he was a fierce character. He lived his life. He had great loyalties. He had great beliefs. He had strength of character. One of his closest friends was Father de Smet, one of the great Jesuits of the 19th century. And you can see if you look at him here, we've got the eagle feather. We have the traditional Indian braids. But we also have that beautiful crucifix, which Sitting Bull wore. And there it is, his gift from Father de Smet. And as I've noted in an earlier lecture, but I think it's so critical to understand how much of a mixing of cultures we have everywhere, Sitting Bull regarded himself as a Catholic. He saw himself as a Roman Catholic, but the problem was he had too many wives from his pre-Catholic days. He had multiple wives at once, and he didn't know what he could do with them if he became Catholic, because he could only remain married to one, and that would mean that he would not be charitable towards the others. And that's not just a problem here. That's a problem in many places where Christianity has encountered. And you have to give Sitting Bull credit for maintaining his integrity on that and recognizing that he had a certain duty to certain people. And no matter what his own religious beliefs had become, he had to live up to that old duty. Sitting Bull, as I mentioned, was regarded as the greatest of his people. And I would recommend, if anyone gets the chance, and it's not as easy to find anymore, but I think one of the great biographies ever written. Truly the best biography written on Sitting Bull, but just incredible, is Bob Utley's The Lance and the Shield, The Life and Times of Sitting Bull. It's beautifully written, it's beautifully researched, and you really get a sense of what the bull was like, what it was that meant, what life really meant to him. And according to Utley, and I think he's right about this in every way, there was a whole series of norms that went along with being a good Sioux. And these norms, which were native to the Sioux culture, to the Lakota culture, and were pre-Christian, pre-Western, pre-Judeo-Christian, were norms that we see arise in many great cultures, but especially in Chinese culture and in Roman culture, where we see the norms and the virtues arise. There were four major virtues for Sitting Bull and for the Lakota. For the Romans, there were three great virtues: piety, labor, and fate. For the Greeks, of course, there was temperance, prudence, justice, fortitude. For the Chinese, under Confucianism, there were the great ideas of patience, family, loyalty. But for the Sioux, and again, importantly, this developed prior to Western culture, as far as we know, the four great ones were bravery, fortitude, property. Interestingly enough, we would probably in the Western tradition call this charity rather than property, because it was the willingness to give away the goods of this world to others, and wisdom. So these are the four great virtues, and according to everybody who knew Sitting Bull, he embodied these virtues. So I don't want to talk a lot about his childhood. It's fascinating, but I want to look at what happens to Sitting Bull really beginning in 1874 with the Great Sioux War, and then taking it up to his death. He was murdered in December of 1890, and his story fits pretty closely to Crazy Horse, whom we talked about in a previous lecture, who was also a Sioux, but Crazy Horse was an Oglala Sioux, Sitting Bull was a Hunk Papa. So two different sub-tribes within the larger Lakota, Western Sioux. And there were actually three major groups of Lakota. There were the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota, depending on what geographical region they came from in the Great Plains. But we're talking about Western Sioux, Lakota, Hunk Papa with Sitting Bull. In 1874 up through 1877, Sitting Bull was not a warrior, but as a medicine man and a leader of his people, he was a protector of women and children, which meant that when men such as Crazy Horse went off to battle, Sitting Bull's job was to stay with the women and children as a guardian over traditional community. He was a line of last resort, should men such as Crazy Horse and fighters at places like what whites remember as Little Bighorn, should they fail, Sitting Bull would be a last defense. And of course, part of his job was not only to defend the women and children militarily, but if necessary, to take them up into the hills, into the mountains, or into escape, maybe into Canada, in order to protect them. In 1877, with the death of Crazy Horse at Fort Robinson and the end of the Great Sioux War, because, well, it's a very complicated story, but because of that, Sitting Bull decides, as a wise man and as a medicine man of his people, to lead as many of his people as possible into Canada and seek protection there, which he does. So in 1877, Sitting Bull leads his people into Canada. They stay there for 4 years, and they do not return then until 1881. When they return in 1881, they are promised by the United States government not only pardon for what they've done, but they are also promised the recreation of their own culture on a smaller parcel of land. That is, they will have to come into the small reservation policy and accept it. Sitting Bull is very worried about this for all kinds of reasons. Number one, he doesn't want to lose their integrity. The integrity of the Sioux, but he's also very worried about the creation of what in the 20th century would be known as a welfare mentality. He doesn't want the Sioux to become dependent upon the United States government. Very famously, he says, after the Civil War, as he watches many Indian tribes accepting the policy to go onto smaller reservations and accept the welfare of the federal government, he says, "Look at me and see if I am poor, or my people either. The whites may get me at last, as you say, but I will have a good time until then. You are fools to make yourselves slaves to a piece of bacon, some hardtack, and a little sugar and coffee." What incredible words from a real man, a man who understands that when somebody gives you something, they own you. And Sitting Bull could not be bought and he could not be sold into slavery. And he did not believe that he had the right to send his own people into slavery either. Therefore, as a medicine man, as a wise man, as a leader of his people, it was his duty to protect them as long as possible. But by 1881, his people were encountering problems in Canada, and the Canadian government was not as willing to protect them against the United States as they had been in the 1870s. Sitting Bull and his people make the decision to return to the Dakotas, to their native lands. And what they find is a complete change, an absolute change in what they had known. That is, in the 4 years they are gone, the American landscape, what had been the Sioux Lakota landscape, had now become something radically different. In place of a land of wild buffalo and teepees, there were now farming settlements all over. Those 4 years had been boom years in the Dakotas, and the areas that the Sioux had once held were now almost completely transformed. And yet Sitting Bull, I think, as a good Stoic, understood that this was reality, and he knew that in some way his people would have to accept this no matter what the dire consequences, and they would have to adjust. Now, here's Sitting Bull again from what I had just given you a moment ago, this idea of being independent and making sure that they did not become dependent upon the federal government. But I also want to contrast this with what he accepts of European American culture that comes in the Dakotas during the 4 years that he is gone. When he returns, and I'm going to read here, if you'll indulge me, just a little bit of what Utley writes so beautifully, and his description of what he sees in America is great, the description here. And I'm reading here, now remember this is The Lance and the Shield, The Life and Times of Sitting Bull, but I'm going to read specifically from pages 236 to 237. Resignedly, though not without repeated protest, he waited. But not for long, for he and his little corps of followers found themselves herded aboard the first downriver steamer named ironically the General Sherman. After shoving off from Fort Buford early on July 29th, the boat nosed itself into Bismarck, landing on a hot Sunday morning, July 31st, 1881. Several hundred citizens in their Sunday best crowded the riverbank to gawk at the celebrity who was Sitting Bull. It was a historic moment for all involved. For the first time, the public looked on the most famous Indian of his epoch, the legendary figure, first vilified, then grudgingly lionized as the slayer of the equally legendary Custer. Remember, he didn't slay him, Crazy Horse did. For 4 years, the press had followed the chief's adventures in Canada. 3 correspondents had interviewed him, and with a red coat not averse to interviews himself, filled out a reasonably accurate portrait. But the sensation mongers showered this image with all manner of fanciful tales and twisted it into a grotesque caricature. For the assembled spectators, Sitting Bull disembarked from the Sherman that morning more a circus freak than the once mighty leader of a proud people. Nor was the novelty of the occasion confined to the throng of onlookers. For the first time, Sitting Bull was about to face sights and sensations never experienced or even dreamt of in his 50 winters. There would be many more in the few winters remaining to him, as also this strange blend of condensation and acclaim to which whites would treat him for the rest of his life. That Sitting Bull handled the culture shock of his day with quiet dignity and relaxed good humor testifies to his uncommon self-mastery. And there's that Roman fortitude, that stoicism, that I think so well found its embodiment in the great figure of Sitting Bull. As the Indians shuffled down the gangplank, people noted the contrast in appearance between Sitting Bull and his chiefs. They sported the best finery they could manage in the circumstances, but the bull affected only blue pantaloons, a white shirt with red stripes painted down the sleeves, and common moccasins sprinkled with a few beads. Red flannel bound the 3 thick braids of his hair, and a red paint streaked his neck, his face, and a part of his hair, a large set of smoked goggles, which someone had provided him to shield his painful eyes, gave his face a bizarre aspect. The lack of display declared one reporter, is for the purpose of impressing the sentimental white man with his poverty. But as Utley tells us, this was not true in the least. It was no such thing, but rather the lifelong custom of a man demonstrating his devotion to the virtue of generosity. Now, how critically important. Here is the Thomistic leader descending the gangplank. Sitting Bull would never have dressed himself in finery, because as a leader of the Sioux people, it was his job, it was one of the four virtues to give away everything he had. And this was not affected. This was a part of his second nature. This was a part of the very being of what Sitting Bull had become as an adult. He was, in this sense, the ultimate Thomistic leader, the man who would give all of himself for the betterment of his people. At once, Sitting Bull confronted a tangible example of an institution he had battled for 4 years, the Northern Pacific Railway. A spur line had been laid to connect the levee with the depot in Bismarck, and the private coach of the firm's general manager, his personal secretary, had been run down to the river behind a locomotive. With a man interpreting, here Sitting Bull boarded the plush car, and he was to be the guest at a reception in the city. He had never seen a railway train. He approached it with trepidation and asked to see it move. When the engineer demonstrated, Sitting Bull shook his head and declared that he would rather walk. Instead, he rode in an army ambulance with his sister Four Horns, and other chiefs crowded in behind him. Now, as he went through the town, there are a number of things that amazed him. For the first time, he tried ice cream. Now, just imagine this. The greatest of the Sioux, gone for 4 years in exile. He comes back, and what does he do? He tries ice cream. He loves it. He goes to the fire station. He's never seen anything like the pole in a fire station, and he insists on going down it several times. He loves meeting pretty women, and when people ask him for his autograph, he makes all of the males pay him money. But for all the pretty women in the Dakotas, they get his autograph for free. He is then taken to Washington, D.C., where he is treated as a celebrity. And what does he do? He spends almost all of his time. He never shows up at the White House because he's so taken with the artwork at the Smithsonian that he cannot get away from the great art in which he looks at huge landscapes and he sees the tiny people in the pictures. He's never seen anything like this. How could you ever depict such a small human in such a big picture? He was astounded by this. At the zoo, he could not get away from the monkeys. He insisted that he buy a monkey and take it back to the Dakotas, which of course was a violation of the Smithsonian rules. I mean, this is a very human man, and yet what a great figure. And those elements of that cultural exchange in 1881 and in the years after, in which it's not only Sitting Bull discovering the New World, but the New World discovering Sitting Bull, is really an incredible moment in 19th century history. This meeting of different cultures. And yet throughout all of this, Sitting Bull maintains his dignity. And most importantly, even when many of the other Sioux give in and acquiesce to the dependence that the United States government has forced upon them, the Bull refuses. Time and time again. So that, to jump the story forward quite a bit, we find Sitting Bull by December of 1890. He has refused to accept federal understandings of the Sioux. He has continually fought against the federal government. And in particular, what the Bull has argued is that if the United States government wants really to understand a free Sioux people, a genuinely Republican people, they have to allow the Sioux to ranch. This is their normal occupation. These are some of the greatest horsemen who have ever existed. And the Bull's argument is, don't make us farmers, allow us to ranch. And he is denied this request time and time again by the U.S. government. And in particular, in one of the most astounding moments of American bravado and nasty arrogance, we see the Bull negotiating with Senator Logan. This is the same Senator Logan who had been the military dictator over New Orleans during the occupation of New Orleans in the Civil War. This is the same Senator Logan who, from Chicago, had said before the Civil War had even begun that he would hew his way through the massacre of civilians all the way down the Mississippi to take New Orleans, which is why he was granted the military dictatorship over the city after it had been conquered. Logan was put in charge of the U.S. Senate committee in charge of the Sioux. And in one negotiation in which Sitting Bull had spoken for his people, saying time and time again, we can find a compromise, we can make this work, but let us be who we are, Logan denied this. And Logan, at one point in the meeting with Sitting Bull, said, and again I read, this is page 259 of Utley's incredible biography, Logan then turned loose with a scathing rebuke. You were not appointed by a great spirit, he asserted. Appointments are not made that way. Sitting Bull was not even a great chief. You have no following, no power, no control, and no right to any control. Sitting Bull lived on a reservation at the sufferance of the government, which provided him food, clothing, and everything he owned. If it were not for the government, you would be freezing and starving today in the mountains. And if you ever behave like this again, meaning challenging the senator in a meeting, you will be put into a guardhouse and made to work. There, again, U.S. tax dollars and the U.S. Senate at work. Horrible. The treatment of a brutal, nasty figure, that is Senator Logan, against a great man like Sitting Bull is horrific. Well, there are a number of things that are happening in 1890. In particular, there is a very important movement among the Sioux Indians called the Ghost Dance. Now, there's a long history to this. The Ghost Dance was created by a Paiute Indian by the name of Wovoka. Wovoka had argued that there was a coming, this was a nativist movement, he argued that there was a coming movement in which all dead Indians would live with all living Indians if the living Indians would begin to dance. And the dance was this very methodical ghost dance, a form of prayer. There was a liturgy to it. And the ghost dance argued that as long as the Indians performed this dance, they would wake the dead. Whites would disappear. Now, there was nothing violent about this. This was, at least from Wovoka's standpoint, this was the idea that the Indians would enter into a kind of eternal purgatory or heaven, a good purgatory, in which the living and the dead would become separate from whites and all other peoples, and they would live in harmony for eternity. Now, this dance caught on to a certain extent in Nevada and California. It never did in places like Arizona and New Mexico, because the Indians in that region had a deathly fear of ghosts and things that were otherworldly. But on the Great Plains, it caught on, and it mutated. As the ghost dance migrated into the Great Plains, it became not just a peaceful movement, but an extremely violent movement, in which those ghost dancing added to it this idea, something Wovoka had never come up with. They added to it the idea that if an Indian is wearing what was called a ghost shirt, he would be protected from all white weapons. Now, all of this comes to a head. Crazy Horse was already gone. Red Cloud had nothing to do with any of this. And Sitting Bull thought the ghost dance was ridiculous. He, remember, was someone who had bought into Catholicism, though he couldn't practice it because of having too many wives. But he had nothing to do with the ghost dance. But the U.S. government was convinced that he did. So, very early morning, in one of the most terrible tragedies of the 19th century, about 4 o'clock in the morning, freezing December morning, right after Christmas, a number of Indian guards, Indian police, Sioux police, people I think we would probably call collaborators with the U.S. government, came and they arrested Sitting Bull. They intentionally arrested him in the dead of night. They pulled him out of his teepee and out of his tent. And once they did, he was only in his underwear, he was in his skivvies. And once they did, of course, he's in his 50s, he's shocked, what's he doing out in this bitter cold? It was an incredibly cold morning in the northern plains. They tried to arrest him. A crowd forms trying to defend this wise man who was standing there in his underwear, Sitting Bull, and a couple of shots went off. We don't know exactly what happened, but a couple of shots went off. And fascinating story. The horse, which was right next to Sitting Bull's accommodation, was the horse that had been given to him as a gift by Buffalo Bill Cody when Sitting Bull had toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And the horse had been trained that when it heard a certain number of shots in sequence, which was part of the circus act, when that happened in Buffalo Bill's show, the horse did a dance. Well, amazingly enough, the shots that went off not only killed Sitting Bull, which is a tragic end to a great man, but at the same time, they were the exact sequence and sounds that the horse had been trained to respond to. And so at 4 a.m, in this icy, nasty Northern Plains morning, with this horrible thing happening, the horse immediately begins to do a dance in front of all the Indians, and they are convinced that this is Sitting Bull's spirit going into the horse and telling them to revolt. And this is when all hell breaks loose. There are all kinds of things going on. But this is in part what leads to what is called the Massacre at Wounded Knee. This is all part of the tension that exists here. At Wounded Knee, at the very end of December of 1890, the Sioux, sick and tired of the government abusing them, now trying to figure out a way in which they can bring this new world about, in which there is harmony between the dead and the living, and all the Indians can be peaceably resigned from whites, openly rebel. And when they do so, the 7th Cavalry, ironically, Custer's old unit, comes into Wounded Knee, and during a series of negotiations in which there is a very tense standoff between American soldiers in the 7th Cavalry and heavily armed Sioux warriors, a medicine man throws dirt up into the air. This is misinterpreted by U.S. military forces as a signal for the Indians to attack, and shots open and hell breaks loose. And we have what is known as the Massacre at Wounded Knee. And it is an absolutely horrific moment in American history. This is a moment in which we can say this is nothing but a pure tragedy. This is a tragedy on all sides, and I'll give you here the numbers. There were 25 U.S. soldiers killed and 40 wounded, but 150 Sioux warriors killed and another 50 wounded. And you can see here the imagery. This is one of the first times that we have photography. Of course, photography had started at Antietam in the Civil War, but to have it like this and for people on the East Coast to see what was going on, there had been an incredible freeze after the massacre, and so they're just bodies littered that are frozen on the Great Plains northern scapes here after the Wounded Knee Massacre. This is really the last battle of the American West and the takeover of the American West. Absolute tragedy. But let me end with this, because this is the conclusion not only of Trails West, but this is the conclusion of the 14th lecture as well. There's one last figure we have to talk about, and I've mentioned him, and I mentioned him in the first 3 lectures, Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner was a great historian, and he was the ultimate progressive. Now, I state that because when we think of progressivism, and I'll jump this forward, and I know there are others in Liberty Classroom who could discuss this much better than I could. Progressivism is not left or right. Progressivism can be found among right-wingers as well as it can be found among left-wingers. It can be in a Hegel or a Marx, it can be in a Francis Fukuyama, or it can be in a Barack Obama. Progressivism is neither left nor right. It's not political. Progressivism is a way of thinking about history. And in the progressive scheme of things, all things happen according to conflict. So progressivism always demands that there is a thesis and an antithesis. These two things collide, and in their collision, a third thing is formed, and that is the synthesis. What Frederick Jackson Turner does is he declares that American history, and he is what we would call a very conservative, moral man. He would by no means be a Marx or a Lenin or a Mussolini. He's not that kind of progressive. It's not political for him, but he is progressive in his history. His understanding of history, as he defines it in 1890, which really has become the reigning academic theory of the American West, and sadly of America, and I think it takes down so much of the complexity of American history and the nuances in American history. What he said in his thesis in 1893, looking at the census of 1890, is that there could no longer be found a visible line of the frontier. And therefore, he said, all of American history is the conflict, jumping forward to this slide again, the conflict between thesis and antithesis creating synthesis, but it was in fact civilization versus savagery, that is, Europe and Indian clashing and becoming a new thing. And this is what American history was. So, as he says, thus, American development has exhibited not merely advance along a single line, but a return to primitive conditions on a continually advancing frontier line, and a new development for that area. American social development has been continually beginning over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating American character. The true point of view in the history of this nation is not the Atlantic coast, it is the Great West. Even the slavery struggle, which is made so exclusive an object of attention by writers such as Professor von Holst, occupies its place in American history because of its relation to westward expansion. In this advance, the frontier is the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. So from Turner's perspective, from the perspective of a Turnerian historian, that is, from a progressive historian, American history ended in 1890. This doesn't mean time ended, but from a progressive viewpoint, because the frontier no longer exists, American history is over. And Turner was quite worried about this. And he believed that we would be rapacious towards the environment, and yet we had no new environment. He believed that we'd become imperialist because we had become a people that was habituated to expansion. In many of his ideas and prophecies, he was absolutely correct. The problem with the Turnerian explanation, which is something that I think the Austrian economists of that same day and age understood very well, was that real ingenuity comes from a process of discovery, not from a simple process of this versus that creating a third thing, but the human mind discovering, uncovering what already exists in nature but had not been seen before. That's the beauty of human creativity. And if you take nothing away from these 14 lectures on the American frontier, please take this away. The American frontier is not a story of limitation. It is a story properly understood of exploitation, imperialism, and brutality. It is also a story of freedom, acquisition, and discovery. It is a story of appreciation, of humanity and dignity. It is a story of association. And if we want to find a real story in the settlement of the American West, it would be this. When left alone, people did relatively well and got along. When interfered with, the consequence was death, destruction, and backwardness. The lesson of the American frontier is this. Allow people to do what they do best. Allow them to be free. Allow them to live their natural rights. And order follows. Thank you. This is the conclusion not only of Lecture 14, but of the entire series Trails West for Tom Woods Liberty Classroom. I'm Brad Berzer, and I've had a great time doing this. I hope you've had a great time listening.